Pequot Enterprises International Education Division presents Grade 3, Unit 1. Okay, welcome to the first content support offered by Chris Pagliuco for Unit 1, which is, let's see, History as Judge for the Pequot War. So our purposes for the video are simply to give you some basic and even extensive information to teach each unit. This one's going to be on the Pequot War, Part 1 of Unit 2. And you can use this as you like. You can not watch it or watch it over and over again, I'm sure. And if you have any questions based on the content, please feel free to email me, which is at wow, this is really hard to use, pagliucoc@madisonkey12.ct.us. Okay, that looks really good. And as I said earlier, this is Part 1 of Unit 2. It should say the Pequot War, and we're approaching this with our students as History as Judge. We're trying to judge what Uncas should do and why. So if we have 5 parts. We have who explored here in Connecticut. We have who settled here and why did they settle. What happened when they arrived. The background on the Pequot War. And then finally, what should Uncas have done? Alright, so let's get started. We're going to cover all of these. And the first one is we're trying to take a look at who explored here. So here we see our map of Connecticut, and we had 2 groups essentially that were exploring Connecticut, but at first, as you may well know, it was, it was primarily Adrian Black, who was Dutch, and he was settled in the New York area down here, and the Hudson River. And his crew, I think when they were in really right off of Manhattan, their ship caught on fire, and they were able to save everything that was below the waterline, so they rebuilt the rest of the ship, which was called the Onrust, which I believe means restless, and they came up and explored the Connecticut shoreline. Of course, Block Island is named after him, and they came up the Connecticut River. As far as Hartford in Connecticut, the river is a tidal river, and Hartford is about as high up as is navigable, and because it's quite shallow actually. Now there's a channel through it, but Hartford was about the limit, and otherwise it's like 2 feet deep or something like that, and ships with a deep draft can't make it. And he landed at Adrian's Landing, for instance, in Hartford. I think that's pretty well known. And sailed and proceeded to Long Island. And so that was the major discovery of Connecticut, and at that point we have 2 groups that were settling this area. The first was the Dutch, who were pushing in from the west, and we can see this in the place names, which is sort of a theme that I'm trying to play on here. So New York used to be not New York but New Amsterdam, And up here is the Tappan Zee Bridge off of 84. Tappan Zee is a Dutch name. Van Cortlandt Park down in the Bronx, I believe, is a Dutch last name. And if you were down around the Bowery in Stuyvesant, Peter Stuyvesant was an early Dutch governor. And we've seen like the Dutch colonial houses, so this is going to be really hard. But a Dutch colonial house will have the roof line sort of like that. It's got 4 parts to the roof line. And a Cape Cod house in the English style simply has the 2. And we see this Cape Cod style house. Wow, this is really not good, but you get the idea. Cape Cod roofline, and then a Dutch colonial roofline has the 4. And you have more space up front, or up top, with the Dutch colonial. And the Dutch initially built a fort at Saybrook. This is not that accurate. And then they even built one up at Hartford initially. But they weren't the only ones who were really interested in the area. There were also the English, who were pushing really down from Massachusetts. And some early places that the English were settling was one in the Three River towns. The English ended up kicking out the Dutch from their little fort, but there were only like literally 6 people there. But the first town was Windsor, and the next town was Hartford, and then the last town is Wethersfield. And technically, that's what made up Connecticut at first. This was Connecticut. Then there was a separate colony called Saybrook. And Saybrook colony consisted of really Westbrook, Old Saybrook, Deep River, Chester, Essex, and Lyme. And eventually, and then there was a third colony, the New Haven colony, which essentially was what is today Clinton, but primarily all the way down to Guilford and Milford, Hamden, that area. And this was three English colonies. And then there was not a separate colony. This one was ultimately going to be part of Connecticut. But there was Norwich and the Thames River. And then Stonington was an early settlement as well. And so eventually these are all going to combine, but for the purposes of the Pequot War, we're really talking, the 1630s, and no, these were separate colonies in the 1630s. They hadn't yet merged. So that's really an interesting idea, not so much for third graders, but at least for you, that they were separate. Of course, they were all English, and they all worked together, at least on the English side, and the Dutch were largely their enemies. Interestingly, I did forget to mention the Dutch did have a fort in Old Saybrook. I mentioned Hartford, but also in Brantford, there's Dutch foundations that have been found. And so this was really the upper reaches of the Dutch area. Okay, let's take a look. We're continuing here. Okay. Also, likewise, of course, there were native peoples who were living in Connecticut, and there were a lot of this story of the interaction between the native peoples and the Europeans is really important, because not so much because these tribes were so large, because I think in the scheme of things they weren't particularly large, especially compared to tribes out west, but they were important because they were a first, and they set a precedent for other for later treatment of native peoples, especially for the English. So for instance, the Spanish did not seek to kill their native peoples or exterminate them. They sought to enslave them for gold, which sounds horrible, but the English policy was really extermination. And that was established here in Connecticut. and New England. So we had several very powerful, well, several tribes in the area. Up in the Massachusetts area, you had, well, really um, all of Cape Cod, I sort of have that misnamed, is, or misidentified there, is this was the Wampanoags. And I mean, I don't know if I would call them powerful, but they were significant. And then up here around that Boston area were the Massachusetts. And then Rhode Island had quite a powerful tribe called the Narragansett, who were a rival of the Pequot. And the Pequot were sort of the bullies of the area. There were other tribes in Connecticut, of course. There were the Eastern Niantics and the Western Niantics, and the Hammonassets right in this area, and the Wangunks up in the Hartford, Glastonbury, Wethersfield area. They were significant. Then there were the Quinnipiacs over by New Haven. And so there were plenty of small tribes in the area, the Mononkey-Tussoks in Westbrook. There were plenty of small tribes, and they were really quite peaceful, but the Pequot were these bullies in the area that were demanding tribute. And so when the English arrive, they were a new player in the area that the different tribes were trying to exploit. They wanted the English as an ally because they didn't see the English so much as first of all, they were pretty weak. The English were few in number and pretty weak, and also the other tribes represented more of a threat. So this is what the native situation was. And what's interesting about that, and what you can communicate to your classes, is that just as the English were rivals of the Dutch over here, and they didn't act in concert with each other just because they were European, the Native Americans did not say, hey, we're all Native American, let's all be nice to each other. They viewed each other more as rivals than they were worried about the English or the Dutch. So they were all autonomous people. They did share a culture in the area, but they all spoke different languages, profoundly different languages. The Native Americans might speak 5 languages as they traveled across the state, which is pretty amazing. And so we wouldn't really refer to them as Native Americans. That's as specific as referring to others as European. That's not very specific. You would refer to them by their tribal name, and that's how they would identify themselves. And it's important to communicate that type of thing. So then we go back, and our lesson 2 is this idea of what happens when the two sides meet. And we call this the oh boy, that's embarrassing, but you get the idea, the Columbian Exchange. And this was the exchange of goods and ideas between the supposedly the old world coming over and the new world going back. Now traditionally, I don't think we see the items here, but traditionally we usually think of civilization coming over from Europe to these savage Native Americans, and we think of not much coming back to Europe, just land and natural resources, because of course Native Americans couldn't give anything to Europeans, but the reality is it was quite the opposite. In many ways, the Native Americans gave more culturally than they received, and this wasn't any act of benevolence on their part. This was just because they of how history played out. So if we take a look at this, I'll explain some of the significance of these, which is worth noting. And please make a mental note of the idea that this is goods and ideas. And I'll talk about the ideas, which will be too sophisticated for your age group, but nevertheless is worth your knowing and can give you confidence as you offer this lesson. So if we take a look at first what the Europeans and Asians and Africans are bringing to the Americas, there are a significant amount of crops, but the interesting thing is that a lot of these crops really didn't amount to much. I'm sure it was good for, to some extent, for Native Americans to get these crops, but um, they didn't really change the world. I would say the big one here that did change the world, and not so good for Native Americans, of course, is sugarcane. That one is a big, big thing. But olives and peaches and pears, those are nice and cute, but they didn't really amount to much. Now, livestock was a really big deal, not because the Native Americans wanted them, but because they severely impacted the environment. And that by bringing pigs over and raising these animals, it undermined the ecology of how the Native Americans were living. And we can blame the hardship of the native groups perhaps on these diseases, which we'll talk about in a minute, or maybe even war, which we're going to get to with the Pequot War. But in reality, it was environmental degradation that undermined the Native American way of life time and time again, and forced them to either move or profoundly change their culture, because their semi-nomadic way of life was far too sensitive to the land, and livestock undermined that. However, an easier one for people to remember is the disease, and diseases killed 90% of, it's commonly accepted that they killed 90% of Native Americans. And those diseases were obviously listed: smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles, malaria, diphtheria, whooping cough, and I think bubonic plague could be added to this as well. And not only did it kill so many people, but it also undermined their religion. So they started to think maybe the Christian gods were more powerful than their gods. And in that way, it just decimated their culture. It was very hard. You can imagine how devastating it would be if we lost 90% of our people. The amount of information and expertise, and how strained the society would become to pass on information. It would be absolutely brutal and devastating. So this idea of the diseases is very significant. And then when you wage the Pequot War and the environmental degradation, it's not an optimistic situation. Now, conversely, the crops that the Native Americans had domesticated and shared with Europe had a really profound change, far more than the olive or citrus fruits being brought over. Perhaps the most significant was the potato and the sweet potato, because these could be grown in northern climates. And so and corn, of course. Corn is a big one. These could be grown in northern climates and led to a massive European population boom. And for instance, before 1500, the powerhouses in Europe, as far as that goes, were Rome, of course. You remember Greece. And then Egypt is also Mediterranean. Carthage was over here and going up into the Iberian Peninsula. So they were all Mediterranean-based societies where it was very warm. But after 1500, you get northern powerhouses such as England, Germany, France, northern France especially, and Russia. So it's no coincidence that these countries were able to get more powerful as soon as these crops were introduced. Another real significant one would be tobacco, simply because that was a major cash crop and Europeans were able to make a lot of money from it. Now, of course, from the African perspective, the Columbian Exchange is pretty important for several reasons. One is a lot of the gold and silver that was brought over from the Americas especially by the Spanish. Well, that undermined the economy of the Gold Coast in Africa, and the price of gold dropped significantly because there was so much more of it in the Americas now. And that encouraged Africans to sell their people into slavery because the economy was struggling so much because the price of gold had dropped. Another thing that encouraged slavery was the fact that sugar could thrive in the Caribbean, such as Jamaica, for instance. A lot of these sugar islands, Martinique, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, these sugar islands, and sugar as well as tobacco are labor-intensive crops, and that is what made slavery profitable. So it was a bad turn of events, the way that turned out, and that encouraged slavery to develop. So primarily to this point, we've talked about goods, and that's really what you're going to emphasize with your kids. However, I did want to mention ideas that mattered. So for instance, when the Europeans arrived in the New World, they couldn't believe the animals that were here, and how did they make it across the ocean? And in the Bible, Noah's Ark was supposed to land over here in Turkey, Mount Ararat, which it mentions in the Bible, and it's like, well, how did these snakes and how did these deer and bear and buffalo get over here from all the way over from Noah's Ark? And then what about the Native Americans? How could they be going to hell for rejecting Christianity when they had never been exposed to Christianity? And these types of thoughts really undermined the Christian faith, and ultimately was a major contributor to the Protestant Reformation, which occurred in 1519, and 1492 is about 27 years earlier. So only 27 years after 1492 is the Protestant Reformation, which is the split of Christianity and the breakdown of Catholicism. Another example is the Europeans saw the decentralized, less hierarchical native societies, and they began to question their own absolute monarchies. And this was proved to be an inspiration for democracy. So those are two examples of how ideas came, the New World, their very existence and alternative ways of life prompted really profound new ideas over in Europe. A lot of these ideas we give credit to the Europeans for, but really their inspiration was the Native Americans. And there's other examples as well. All right, so then we have, let's see. Okay, so we did who settled here. It was the Dutch and the English, and Adrian Block was the primary explorer. We mentioned some settlements there. Who settled here and why we'll return to. Actually, we'll just do that now. So let's see. I don't know if I have a picture of this. Yeah, I don't think I do. So we're just going to have to use this. That's great. Okay, so who settled here and why? It was primarily Puritans. Ooh, Puritans. Wow, it is really hard to write with this thing. It's embarrassing. Sorry about that. Puritans came here from Massachusetts, and a Puritan was a type of Christian who sought to purify the Catholic Church, or the Anglican Church, which was the Church of England. And so what did they want to do? Well, they wanted to get rid of all hierarchy, such as bishops and archbishops and priests, and they wanted Christianity just to come down to God, the Bible, and themselves. So there was no, Puritans wouldn't believe in Christmas because Christmas is not mentioned in the Bible. Now Easter could be because that was about the resurrection, and that is in the Bible. So all these saints' days, all the saints, they're all out, according to Puritans. All the religious holidays, they're gone. All of the sacraments, except for baptism, which was mentioned in the Bible, and maybe the Eucharist, yes, at the Last Supper was mentioned in the Bible, but the other sacraments are out, and they were supposed to work for God. And the Puritans were not very popular, especially, well, really anywhere. And so because they disapproved of the English church, which was called the Anglican Church, they left for Holland, and they lived there, but were so disappointed in the filthy lifestyle of the Dutch that they came over here to America to establish what's famously called a city upon a hill. And this was supposed to be a model society for the world to follow. And this was a famous sermon offered by, I believe, John Winthrop. And it shows how the Puritans thought the world's eyes were upon them and how virtuous their lifestyle was. Now, it's interesting because the Puritans were really not, they were not treated particularly fairly over in England, and they weren't liked very much, but they were really quite an intolerant people who did not like people who deviated from their puritanical ways. They weren't called Puritans at the time. They were called hot Protestants because they were so passionate about Protestantism. I have another video that can explain Protestants and Catholics. So they came over here to New England to establish these model Christian societies, and interestingly, New Haven was the most strict out of all of them. And they were called, I think, the Bible Commonwealths is the name. And so the ones in Connecticut, they were pretty strict, quite honestly, especially compared to Massachusetts. And the first ones were to, this was Thomas Hooker, and they came to the Hartford area. And New Haven, as I mentioned, was the most strict. And that's as far as we're going to go with that. So what did a Puritan do? Well, the Puritan values are things that we know very well today. For one, they valued education. And the reason they valued education was because they wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible. In Anglicanism and Catholicism, it was the priest who read the Bible and explained it to people. But now the priest is out, and there's just you, the person, the Bible, and God. So people needed to be able to read the Bible and understand it and judge for themselves, because the priest wasn't doing it anymore. Another thing they needed to do was to work hard. Now this had to do with the idea of predestination. The Puritans thought that God had already chosen who went to heaven and who wasn't going to. And so the Puritans, in order to be considered one of the predestined, well, the people who go to heaven work hard. It's industry. And they would look for their vocation or calling, what you're supposed to do, what God designed you to do, your vocation. I know that's horrible, but that's all I've got, I'm afraid. And let's see, what is another one? Oh, another one is thrift. Now, the idea here was that your mind should be on God, not on material items in this world. So if you maybe were educated and read the Bible and maybe worked hard and didn't take pleasure in earthly things, you might be one of those elect, one of the saints who was predestined to go to heaven. And that was, if you did these things and things were working out for you, that was a sign of God's grace and a sign that you were one of the elect. So a lot of these are built into our society here in New England today. We have the old idea of that thrifty New England farmer who never threw anything out, and education, of course, with the Ivy League schools primarily being in New England, with a few exceptions like Princeton and Cornell in Pennsylvania and UPenn, but a lot of others are in New England. And boy, do we ever preach hard work is the key. So even though New England isn't particularly puritanical anymore, a lot of these puritanical values have persisted. And this all brings us to the culminating activity of the Pequot War. And what we have here is, although we have these Bible commonwealths, Saybrook, New Haven, Hartford, we have, and they were here for religious purposes, they also did need to make money. And the way that they were making money was the sale of pelts, or really furs, and particularly beaver furs. They were really, these beaver skin, beaver fur hats and coats were really popular in Europe, and they were making a killing on them. And at this early stage in the 1630s, this hinterland in Massachusetts and Connecticut was where the fur trade was based. And shortly thereafter, they'll exterminate all these animals, and they'll keep pushing west and then west again, further and further as time goes on. But for now, in this early stage, there was a real economy in beaver skins or beaver furs, and it was the Native Americans who often controlled the land and often knew how to acquire these furs the best. So we have the English coming in from the east, and we have the Dutch coming in from the west, and neither of them wanted the Pequot trading with the other. And so the Pequot were caught in the middle, and they knew they were, and they liked that position. And everybody was fighting over this beaver trade. And so at this point, the Narragansett had sided with the English to go against the Pequot, because the Narragansett wanted to be the big tribe in the area. And most of the other tribes actually didn't like the bully Pequot tribe, so they sided with the English as well. And the Pequot were quite big and powerful, and they had sort of a civil war, so to speak, where ultimately Uncas decided to divide from the Pequot, and he controlled this area up near Norwich and really all the way over to the Connecticut River and the inner part of Connecticut. A lot of eastern Connecticut was controlled by the Mohegan. His son Joshua sold a lot of land, and now the land trust is called Joshua's Tract. So that's an interesting example. And there's a rock on the Connecticut River in Essex called Joshua's Rock. So ultimately, the Mohegans sided with the English against the Pequot as well. And it was sort of a winner-take-all situation where they were all piling up on the Pequot. And economically is really what it comes down to, is this was an economic war. So you'll read a lot about like John Oldham being attacked on Block Island, and some Pequot tribal members being kidnapped. And those were the sparks that started the war, but really it was the economic fight over the fur trade that caused the war. And Sassacus was the Pequot leader who was going against the Narragansett, the English, and all the other tribes. And Uncas broke away from the Pequot and formed the Mohegan tribe and decided to side with the English. And not surprisingly, the English remember the Uncas with favoritism, and they tried to completely forget the Pequot in English history. So the purpose of our unit is to put ourselves in the footsteps of Uncas and say, well, here's the situation. These tribes feel this way about the Pequot. The English and Dutch are coming in. What choices did Uncas have available to him? What was the wisest choice and why? And then how did that turn out for him? So we're trying to put the kids in the shoes of the Native Americans at this time. And it's not only about allies and enemies in Connecticut for the Mohegan, it's also about that bit with the Columbian Exchange, about what was happening to them environmentally, which is a nice, important message for people to consider. Okay, I hope this was really, I know it was long-winded. I hope it was helpful to you. And if it is, please let me know, and I'll be sure to make more of them. All right, thank you very much.